Hi folks, this episode is an interesting one. We conceived of the idea and tackled it in our typical manner, with lots of booze and bad jokes. But as we began to assemble this for production, we started to reflect a bit on the seriousness of this issue. We are very committed to our industry and analytics community being a place for every practitioner. As you listen, you'll probably hear plenty of times where we get it wrong, or are ignorant, or don't have a good understanding of all the issues. And it will be very clear that we are not super comfortable. But instead of shy away from the topic, and maybe not even release this episode, we want to press in, and in our own faltering way participate in this discussion. It's too important not to. So in our own imperfect way, we present this episode of the Digital Analytics Power Hour.
Welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. 3 analytics pros and the occasional guest discussing digital analytics issues of the day. Find them on Facebook at facebook.com/analytics hour. And now, the Digital Analytics Power Hour.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. This is episode 24. Have you ever listened to this podcast and wondered if anyone else listening was a woman? No? Well, that's very sexist of you, and you should feel terrible. Unless, of course, you are a woman, and then I'm sexist for asking the question. The one thing we can all agree on is that our industry needs more representation by women. They're awesome, and we need more of them. So we needed somebody to help us, because obviously I'm joined tonight by my co-host, Tim Wilson, senior partner at Analytics Demystified.
Good day.
And, of course, Jim Kane, CEO of Babbage Systems and Napkin.
Hello.
And everyone's used to me by now. I'm Michael Helbling from Search Discovery. But, of course, we're all dudes. And so we need help with this topic. Who better to be our guide for this discussion than the Digital Analytics Association Rising Star in 2014 and the Practitioner of the Year in 2015, Google's very own Krista Seiden. Welcome, Krista.
Thanks for having me.
Krista, I'd love to hear how you started into digital analytics. You've been in the industry for quite some time. You've had many roles, but everybody's story is unique. Maybe our listeners would probably love to hear yours.
And have you always been a woman in the industry, or? Sorry.
So I do think I've always been a woman in the industry, but I don't know. Maybe at some point in a past life that was different. So I got started when I was working at Adobe Systems several years back, and I was there actually pre-Omniture acquisition, so for Adobe proper. And one day I was responsible for making dashboards for Shantanu, the CEO, and I realized that I was getting a lot of the metrics from Omniture, but I was going to several different people to pull those metrics for me. And so as somebody curious about the tool, I went ahead and went to that team and asked them to teach me what they were doing. And that kind of spiraled into an interest for digital analytics, or at the time, web analytics. And then Adobe acquired Omniture, and I was blessed to be able to take pretty much every training course that I wanted from them, which was great. I took several courses. I learned everything about all of those products, and it really became a career for me. So I did that for a few years at Adobe. Then I moved on to the Apollo Group, where I ran mobile analytics and social analytics for an internal social app for them. And that was great. I did that for about a year, and then came over to Google. And at Google, my first 2 years, I ran an analytics and optimization program for the Google for Work team as an internal practitioner. Built out a A/B testing program scaling from 1 test all the way up to 50 tests a quarter. Built a solid platform of Google Analytics through Google Tag Manager, and really enjoyed that. And then just about a year ago, I moved over to the actual Google Analytics team as an analytics advocate. So today I represent the brand out in the industry, do a lot of conference speaking. It's how I've met a lot of you guys. It's been awesome. And I also run a premium training program. So education all around. It's very fun, and it's been quite the journey.
Have you gotten, are you close to getting Adobe to adopt Google Analytics as their web analytics platform of choice?
I'm working pretty hard on it.
Okay. or vice versa. I guess I could ask with my tongue in the other cheek.
And, if you could name one person at Adobe who's made you feel the most marginalized. No, I'm just kidding. But actually, so to kick off sort of just the discussion, it's not sort of a question of how is it for a woman in this industry, but it is a perspective that we lack, right? And I wonder, help us see through your eyes when you're going through your professional career. Are there things that are happening that we could be better aware of? How do we, kind of promote? I don't know. This question is going nowhere fast, but I hope does that make any sense?
What's it like to be a woman in
yes,
analytics?
But not necessarily that weirdly asking it. It's just, are there, I don't know. Are there differences? Are there not differences?
This is the fumbling that is going to happen from three wise-ass guys all night long where we try to not completely torch ourselves by acknowledging, which we haven't really yet, and we've acknowledged it many times leading up to this episode, but we asked Krista to come on to talk about the state of women in analytics and immediately felt horrible about asking her to come on because she was a woman to talk about the state of women in analytics. I feel like we should kind of throw that out and should probably also acknowledge that Krista has sort of set herself up for that because she's written pretty thoughtfully about the subject. So Krista will likely, if we don't completely alienate her on this show, we'll have her back to talk about something completely non-gender related. But tonight, we've said we're going to bite the bullet and embrace her gender. Like that, see? There. Now that question goes
you're
nowhere.
The best.
Thank you for embracing
You just made Helbling look awesome.
No,
that's what
I feel such a schlep. I'm like, how do you...
But so can we like start off maybe like you've got to, because you've been asked about it so many times, but how well can you sort of recap the competing internal debates you had that you tried to work out in the LinkedIn post that we'll definitely link to? Like, is that a fair place to ask you to start?
Yeah, sure. So that post, it was really sparked by a couple of events. So in one case, I was presenting at a conference and was actually asked during the Q&A part of the keynote session if I was married. That's a question that you would never get to a male presenter. My fellow male presenters did not get those questions. And it was very offensive as a woman. And, one of the other things that I pointed out was that I don't want to necessarily be known as a woman in analytics, which I know is kind of what we're talking about here tonight, is being a woman in analytics. So maybe you have the wrong person there. But I want to be known as being a strong person, a strong speaker, a strong practitioner, somebody who's just really good in my field rather than being known by my gender. So a couple of the things that I call out in that post are really that as a woman, I hope that you don't be intimidated by what is traditionally a male-dominated industry. I think that we're a pretty good representation here on this podcast at 75-25 for what the industry is like. But don't feel held back based on your gender, I guess. Attend events, get involved, get out there, speak, teach, do everything that you can and should do, and don't let gender hold you back. And then I think the other thing that I really hope to get across in that post was that society as a whole needs to move past that gender role bias. And that we need to really recognize people based on, what they bring to the table and not just because of their gender.
So let me ask, there were two kind of mental exercises I went through leading up to this. And one was realizing that my first two managers in analytics were women. So I actually came into the field reporting to women. And then the second exercise was of kind of my client base, sort of counting the genders of the analysts. Is it still 75-25? Is there more parity? Because I kind of landed at about 50-50, and I didn't want to think about it too much because then I'd have to say, why are we having this episode at all? But I don't think it's necessarily just about the numbers. I don't think there necessarily is stats. I mean, I guess you can look at who's speaking at conferences, but I don't know that that's a fair representation of the industry. I mean, do you feel like, not in your role as a woman, in your role at Google, I mean, you're bouncing around to a lot of companies, and do you feel like it's about 75-25 still?
Maybe not 75-25, maybe 70-30 or even 60-40 at some places.
Nail you down I don't think there's hard data on it, so it's more of
I don't know.
Too late. Already tweeted.
I don't see it being equal yet. I think that there's still quite a difference in terms of the balance there. Somebody at one of these conferences actually said something interesting to me when we were talking about this, about how the conference was about 70-30 in attendees. We were talking about how that's better than it has been over the past few years. And the thought that this person had was, well, it's probably because marketing and sales are moving closer to analytics, and marketing and sales are becoming more data-driven. And that's probably why we see more women, because they're coming from marketing and sales. And I mean, I think that's maybe fair and maybe true, but at the same time, I also find it a little offensive.
Well, that's kind of not how you want to solve the problem, right?
Exactly.
And that's interesting. And Tim, I like that you brought up that your first two bosses were, because actually my best manager I ever had in analytics was also a woman. And I learned so much from her, as like a lot of my leadership style came from her. And so, like, I don't know, recently I was at a conference where I was on a panel talking to college students. And so I'm trying to get all of these college kids interested in careers in analytics. And the predominant number of people in the room were women. And I was like, how can I convince these women, this is such a great industry. You need to be in this industry. We need you in analytics. And I don't know, like, from your perspective, Krista, are there barriers? Do you talk to people and they say, I don't know if I want to get into analytics? Do people view it a certain way? Because it is very skewed towards men historically, but how can we break down the barriers and make it attractive to everybody?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that it's amazing that both of you have had really strong female bosses in leadership in the past in analytics. I've had some really great managers, none of whom have been women. And so, perhaps my viewpoint is a little skewed there. I don't know too many women managers in the analytics field, at least within my sphere of influence and friends and networks. So I think that's really cool. But in terms of getting more women interested into analytics, I think that part of it might be that analytics is seen to be kind of a technical field, and that is scary maybe to some younger women who are coming in and they're like, well, I don't know if I want to, go into engineering, if they're trying to figure out what they're doing in college, if they want to go into computer science or go down that path of a more technical route. And I think that maybe that's an education thing. Maybe we need to help the industry understand a little bit more that there's different types of analysts and there's different roles that you can play in the industry, and that, anybody can fill any of these roles. But if you're less comfortable on the technical side, there's more of the business analysis side. And if you're more comfortable on the technical side, then that's definitely the way to go. I don't know.
That's interesting. If you think of like STEM, right, there's all the concerted effort for the STEM world to get better gender balance. What I was kind of hearing you say was, well, if there's some young girl, there's my daughter, and she's saying, I don't really want to do science and technology. That's not really what I want to do. Analytics falls in this kind of weird tweener space where it's got technical and it's got business, and there's a risk that they'll so shy away from technical that they'll not because they're women, just because they just fundamentally aren't interested in technical, that it's a little bit more nuanced to say this is this really rich space where you have to have this broad set of skills and need to be able to be right-brained and left-brained, and it's just a tougher thing to sell in to anyone. I guess I don't know that I'm as bothered by if it's marketers who are drifting towards it, because nobody started in this career. Nobody who's over 30 started out in analytics. So everybody came from somewhere. And I came from technical writing. Jim came from sales. So you have to come from somewhere. So if we're getting better representation somewhere and there's enough analytics there for somebody to be drawn to it, you just want to make sure that door is open. If they say, yep, I want to step in that direction, it's not, I'm going to show up at a conference and have scantily clad women, dancing in alcoves at an after party. That was a shock to me.
What kind of conferences do you go to?
That was absolutely a very prominent conference where one of the parties had, people who were there were either incredibly uncomfortable, which was me, or were incredibly into it, in which case my opinion of those people plummeted. But I don't know, Jim, you have anything to say?
I have a hard time having good perspective on this one because A, I'm a dude. B, 75% of Napkins analysts are girls, and it's always kind of been that ratio. And I just hire the best people for the job. I mean, I don't have a whole lot to say. I mean, the one thing I would be curious about is that coming from a background of enterprise sales, there was both a lack of representation and a respectful culture for female salespeople to really be able to develop their own skills and not have to kind of align with a bunch of douchey bro sales guy stuff. And that's changing a little bit now. But, again, big sales teams tend to be female unfriendly, even if they're very talented at their work. And what I would wonder is there's definitely, to some extent, a lack of representation, especially at the more senior level in our industry for female analysts. But I've never really felt the same level of cultural misalignment. And frankly, I didn't fit in big sales teams either. I'm a skinny guy who likes to make dick jokes. Like, I just didn't fit in with the big hardware sales guys. So the easiest way to put it is this came out of an eMetrics conference, this whole concept. I don't go to a single trade show or conference other than eMetrics where people are sharing best practices, trying to hook each other up. It's like a very kind of forgiving and respectful community.
Wait, hook each other up in a professional...
Yeah, here's some crystal meth. That's exactly what I'm talking about. No, if when I'm at a retail conference, if someone did something that worked, they're going to sell that idea to get a job somewhere else. They're not going to take you out for a beer and take you through how to be a better, retail paid search guy or whatever it is. I just find our industry is particularly respectful to all comers. It's global, but again, I'm a boy. I don't know whether it's culturally respectful to female analysts in the same way. So that's kind of what I'm curious about.
Krista, how many anecdotes do you have? I mean, that's the thing where Krista's like the one that's like, yeah, you'd think that, but my God, the number of douchey guys she's managed to cross paths with is staggering.
Yeah, Tim and I were in Australia, and I had a guy walk up to me after my presentation who basically said, "You're hot, and I'm going to marry you someday." To which I responded, "Excuse me, this is a professional conference." And then he just followed it up with, "Yeah, he didn't care. I was hot," and he walked away.
You should have told him to integrate his API up his own back end. That's what I would have said.
That would have been good. I was so shocked at the time, though. I didn't have a good comeback.
But, I mean, can you imagine if, Chris, to your credit, you've been in the industry for a while. You're comfortable on stage. You're comfortable in a crowd. I can't even imagine if that was some analyst who had been in the job for 6 months or 9 months and had gotten sent to a conference, so probably wasn't speaking, and some guy walks up and says that, like, just represent, because that was my reaction when that happened. I said, "Are you kidding? Like, what rock did that guy crawl out from under?" On the one hand, like, oh, that would never happen. And of course that was, you're like, well, yeah, that's kind of what happened in Amsterdam, and that's kind of what's happened, so there's probably starting to march down the feminism writ large path, but like, what moron would actually think in any setting, any time after 1992, that could be that oblivious to appropriate behavior?
Before 92, that was okay, Tim? I mean, come on.
Well, I'm trying to think to the last time that I was...
last time it happened to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Lee Eisensee proposed to me right after I got off stage one time, but that's the only person, and I knew he was joking. So...
To Jim's point earlier, I do think and agree that our industry is very welcoming on a whole. And that, people who are new to conferences, especially something like eMetrics, everybody is there to network, to share ideas and best practices, and they're all very open to all of the new people who are coming, and I think that's amazing. I don't think that necessarily means that people have moved past some of the kind of gender roles that I've felt more recently in Amsterdam, in Australia. Another one that happened to me also in Australia was somebody saying, I knew I recognized you, but I couldn't put my finger on it. So I Googled your name and I figured out you were the GTM course instructor. It's nice to see that you're more than just a talking head. Just to think that somebody on camera, teaching a course is probably just a paid talking head.
Yeah.
That was pretty offensive to me as well. But yeah, I don't know. It's kind of hard for me to tie the two worlds together because I do think that our industry is so welcoming, and at the same time, I've unfortunately felt some non-welcoming, comments.
I'm trying to think of a company in the analytics space that kind of tends to do highly produced videos with professional actors and actresses. If only I could think of... Wait a minute. You really do hate Adobe now, don't you?
Oh, I had my roots there. I can't hate them.
So I guess there's the conferences, but then there's also what's really happening in companies. And I guess that's another one where my personal, when I was client side, it seemed like I was at fantastic companies, or specifically one fantastic company, and it seemed like completely a non-issue. And it was a company that was very, very engineering heavy. Not that there wasn't some degree of misogyny and some degree of whatever sexism occurring here and there, but overall as a company, it seemed fairly progressive and enlightened on that front. And I guess I don't know if any of us have great insight into the state of pick your typical large company. And as analysts, we have to struggle so hard to build relationships with the business as it is. I could see take feminine qualities of being listeners, whatever. I'm being sexist right now. No, I think there's been plenty of literature that could be an asset of saying, yes, I can establish relationships. I can listen a little better. I can be responsive, but at the same time, is that potentially also that battle of, I'm stuck with not having credibility because there's latent sexism in the groups that I'm trying to build credibility and rapport and relationships with?
So, I think made a couple of good points. I've worked in companies as an analyst where it's been a fairly even split, men and women, and I've also worked on teams where it was 5 guys and me. So I've seen both sides. I do think that at the lower levels, there is a much more even split. But I think as you move your way up the ladder, you see a lot fewer, women in leadership positions in analytics and tech and business in general. But I have actually been on the side of things where I've been told, hey, in a meeting with engineers, don't say something like this because they will think that you're stupid. And, I don't think that any of the guys in those meetings were told the same thing.
Would have been helpfully coached in that way. Somebody who sort of had the good intention, but...
Yeah, it was totally a good intention. And I'm sure that it, helped me in that situation to take that advice. But, why do we have to be in situations like that in the first place? Can't we all be credible just because we're smart enough to work at these companies and smart enough to be on these teams and these projects already?
That's why it's called casual racism and casual sexism and not on purpose asshole, right? Like someone just spins something because they think it's appropriate to you when it's not really particularly appropriate. I was actually wondering if we could go back to the statement you made earlier about, because I would guess that as a senior practitioner, you have all kinds of people asking for your advice. And as a prominent female analyst, you probably have a lot of girls starting their careers asking you questions. You touched earlier on the fact that the engineering or the technical piece of being an analyst can be a turnoff to female practitioners. Is that a thing?
So I don't know if it's, a thing in particular. I think that the idea of being technical can be scary because generally who you are in meetings with are, a bunch of male engineers. And I think for some women that can be intimidating. It's never really been too intimidating for me, but I don't think that I'm necessarily the norm there. I've met and talked with a lot of women who do get intimidated in those situations. How we get past that, it's hard. It's people taking it on themselves, companies, teams, managers taking it on themselves to try to make and encourage a really inclusive environment. And how you do that without seeming sexist in the first place, well, I think that we've noticed here during this podcast that's pretty difficult.
Yeah. You know what else is difficult? Is figuring out what beverage to drink on the podcast. What's your beverage of choice, Krista?
That's a great question. So I'd say in the past 2 years or so, I've really taken a liking to scotch. And that is actually...
Isn't that a man's drink?
Well, I've got a story.
You probably drink it with a lot of ice in it, though, right? Just like a like a little lady.
Jim does.
Oh,
no ice for me. I drink my scotch neat.
Oh man.
So I actually decided a while back that I wanted to drink scotch at an E-Metrics in Berlin, and I was out with Jim Stern and a few other people, and they were drinking scotch, and they were having great conversations about this scotch, and it seemed to be like a conversation starter and kind of like a boys' club. I was the only girl there, and I was drinking a Mandarin vodka soda. So I didn't really fit in so well. So I decided kind of then that this is something that I wanted to explore. It took me another year or two before I was ready to try it out. It used to kind of make me queasy, even the smell of it. And then I happened to be at a after party for a conference, and it was a sponsored open bar, and I had told a couple of my friends that I really wanted to try to learn to like scotch. And so we did a scotch tasting right there, and I walked away with at least being able to stand Lagavulin. And from there, I really developed a taste for it. But I do think that it is absolutely seen as a man's drink, and that one of the biggest reasons that I wanted to drink it was so that I could have conversations and be part of the boys' club.
You don't have to drink scotch to be part of the man's club to be in analytics. But since Matt Gershoff, who a lot of people know in the industry, and his wife, not defining her as his wife and being sexist, but I'm just drawing the chain to Heather Green, the author of Whiskey Distilled, A Populist Guide to the Water of Life. It's interesting when you start thinking about women in traditionally male-dominated things. I got that book right after it came out. So if you're at all interested in scotch and whiskeys and when it has an E and when it doesn't, and the history and the background and how to even set up a tasting, it's a fantastic book. But she actually talks about that early on in the book about, hey, I was in Scotland, I knew scotch had this thing that it's a man's drink, and she's like, honestly, that it's got such a perception as that women don't even give it a shot. And plus, if they do give it a shot, then they're looked at kind of funny. And one of her many missions, I think, is to kind of change that. So there's a book plug.
I'll have to check it out.
Oh, you're getting
Very
a copy
awesome.
for subjecting yourself to this.
Also a Lagavulin fan, and that is a stout beverage. So you got into drinking scotch just because of Jim Stern, basically.
Yep, and now almost every time I see Jim Stern, we have some scotch together.
That's awesome.
That does remind me, there's other little parallels to this. I'll throw it out. So Annie Duke, I'm not a big follower of poker. I don't really play, so I'm only vaguely aware when it's on. But she's kind of a little bit of she's a lot of a legend, I think, in the professional poker world. And it was like, I remember hearing the story years ago, how she kind of got into it because of her brother. And she actually got into it very much because she has an analytical mind. But there was a recent podcast episode, new podcast from NPR, from Shankar Vedantam, The Hidden Brain, where he talked to her. And it's interesting listening to you talk, Krista. He talked about the stereotype effect. And so he was talking about a little broader than just sexism, but another case where she was sitting at the World Championship of Poker Tournament of Champions final table. She was the only female at the table with 8 or 9 guys, and how, on the one hand, intimidating, on how there was a certain level of sexism at play, and how it both threw her, like she got rattled and talked about at a break being a complete train wreck based on how she was being treated, but at the same time kind of turned it around and said, oh, I can play against that stereotype and kind of use it as a motivator, which I don't know that I'd put you at the Annie Duke level from that skewed of an industry, or necessarily that major of a stage. But it does seem like there are more and more sort of pockets of examples out there. And it does sort of feel like in analytics, the bar's not that high. Like, I feel like we need to be aware of it, cognizant of it, watching out and aggressively correcting people who don't seem to be. I mean, honestly, if you'd pointed out that guy, I would have gone and said something to him. Which, oh, wow, that sounds bad, too.
See, Krista doesn't need you to be her knight in shining armor, Tim.
And it's more, I want to go and like, really? Like, you're a fucking idiot. Like, what?
Yeah.
I cannot fathom.
The mind boggles. And maybe it's because that's just not an experience that any of us has ever had, coming off a stage at a conference and then getting a remark or a comment like that. You know?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of calls into question, like, do we need at conferences, do we need some kind of like a code of conduct? And is that sad that we have to have a code of conduct because of these types of instances? I was actually talking with my boss about this, and he mentioned that he's never even realized that this could be an issue because he himself has never faced it, despite how many stages he's been on.
I'm just, again, if you go to a conference and you say no one's allowed to say anything uncomfortable and douchey, you know, and when a lot
None
of people,
of the three of you would be allowed.
I wouldn't be allowed out of my
I wouldn't
house.
be allowed to talk, that's for sure.
But, you know, I mean, there's going to be someone like that at every single show, right? I think the interesting thing just comes back to, you know, we project forward 10 years, there will be certain disciplines. And actually, I was kind of wondering if data science would come up as kind of the companion discipline to digital analytics. And there seems to be a different vibe and a different level of representation to female data scientists in that particular industry as there is in ours. We go forward 15 years, what's the ratio going to be? What's the culture going to be like? Where was the glass ceiling placed? Was there one? And I think that in our particular discipline, some people's minds need to change. But as I mentioned earlier, I think it's a more forgiving industry than some of the other ones. But if we go forward 50 years, there's still going to be a dick at a conference asking if you're married. Sorry about that one.
It's true.
But even beyond the conferences, I mean, I guess it's probably fair to say this is episode 24. Along about episode 12 or 13, as we were recording, we reached out to somebody prominent in the industry. He was like, hey, can you come on? And at some point we'll get him on. And he kind of threw out, you haven't had any women on. And I would say that one comment has pretty much now constantly hung over since then we've had women on, not to talk about women in analytics. We've got multiple women who have agreed to come on, and we haven't managed to make it scheduling just because they're solid people in the industry. But
so you're saying I'm helping to fill your quota.
You're right. It is.
Well, you're not hurting it. That's
for
sure.
Crazy the level of. I mean, this probably gets to the entire affirmative action. I mean, it definitely gets into a large issue. But it was a fair point that we're saying, hey, we want to talk about data governance. Like, well, you know, John Lovett's out there talking about data governance. Let's get John Lovett on. We want to talk to someone in Europe about analytics in Europe. Well, Matthias Batag is available. So I think there's a fair, outside of conferences, and not to say that there are not topics we have not covered where the first name that came to mind wasn't a male, but it's kind of a legitimate where I feel like we've done a little bit of hand wringing saying, what the fuck? You know, why is that happening to us? Now, I've got a little bit of a theory that the industry is rapidly growing, and we are sometimes saying the industry 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of times the people we're trying to bring on are more the middle-aged people who have wound up in consulting or agencies where they're a little more free to talk. So it may be more of kind of an asynchronous time issue, but I've probably spent more brain cycles beating my liberal self up about why, like what is going on there. So I think it goes beyond conferences. If that's happening in companies where they're saying, well, you know, we happily would have promoted a woman into the leadership position, but gee, we honestly looked at the candidate pool and there were 8 men and 1 woman. And as it turned out, one of the men turned out to be the best candidates. Is there a level of well, some of this is a time thing. In 5 years, we listen back to this and say it's laughable. You guys didn't realize that hurdle had already been crossed, or not?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that there are significantly fewer women who are well known for their specialties in the industry. And, that's probably because they haven't necessarily been given as much respect or of a global stage in the past. And that's why those names still don't come to mind. But I also think that there's just a lot fewer women overall. So you're naturally going to have more men come to mind when you're talking about a variety of topics.
But you said that changes. You were saying earlier that you sort of felt like at the more junior levels, if we don't say it's the junior levels because they can't progress, if it's at the more junior levels, there's a little bit more parity because the gender mix of those entering the industry is getting to a more balanced spot, then it will come. I don't know. I'm not claiming that's going to happen. It's just one of the.
And I think what it's driven for me anyway is just some heightened awareness of just trying to be more cognizant of the fact that, hey, yeah, like say for our podcast specifically, yeah, it is interesting. We have not had as many women guests as men guests, and it was sort of eye-opening. And now we do think about it, and we try to be more aware. But I don't know. I mean, Krista, you're kind of carrying a heavy load in this conversation because you're representing all women to our audience. At the same time,
that is a heavy load.
Well, I think there are a lot of awesome analysts out there who are women, who are up and coming, who are going to be leaders in our industry, and all that we can do to help them along their way and get them to those places of leadership and industry visibility that we can. I think that's kind of what our job is, and I'm excited about it. Those women are out there, and we just got to get them, we just got to bring them up and get more exposure and visibility to let other women know this is a great industry for you, not just for guys.
The other kind of data point I have is the Web Analytics Wednesdays in Columbus, and we are getting pretty damn close to 50-50 with the gender mix at those events. And a lot of that I actually see is because we've got some of the connections into universities. So a lot of times there's students who are kind of interested in the space. And luckily we have professors who are supporting it, saying, if you're interested, you should go there. So that's another one of those where I look at it and say, man, it's coming.
Well, listen, we have run up on our time limit, but let's go around the horn and maybe just share thoughts and impressions. Not necessarily, hey, what did you learn? Krista, what have you learned this evening? No, it's not really that kind of podcast, but I think there's some interesting takeaways, I think, for at least us from the show. But let's go run around and see what people are thinking.
I'll say for me, this continues to be the murkiest topic. I feel like we got to less resolution. This is one where I have more than ever before would love to have people. Oh, let me be honest. I'd love to have some women chime in on the Facebook page or privately and say, you're way off base. Your perception of it's heading in the right direction, still a little bit of an issue. We need to be aware. That's kind of where I feel like we landed. If there are people out there saying, holy cow, specifically as a female analyst, what Krista, her conference experiences happen to me once a quarter in my job, which hopefully is a get the hell out of that job. Like, that's just not good and right. But I now feel like we definitely put Krista in an unfair spot of being, taking the responsibility of representing all women in analytics. I don't know. I don't know where we are and how much we should continue to wring our hands about it.
Yeah, I think that, to your point, the future is bright. I think that there's a lot more gender equality coming into the industry. And that is definitely led by university and just that younger generation entering the workforce. But I do think we still have a long way to go. And I think that this past hour, we've realized that there's no one answer to this problem, or I don't know if we'd consider it a problem or what we even call it, because in some ways it seems like there are issues that need to be tackled, and in others it seems like equality is right on the horizon. I think the biggest takeaway for me here is really that we need a lot of people, a lot of women, a lot of men to kind of stand up and be those spokespersons for, equality and for just making sure that the best person is getting the recognition and getting the jobs and the promotions and the events, and don't bring gender into that equation.
I was quieter than usual today. I struggled with this one. Again, it's a difficult one for me because, I'm a boy. I'm also a CEO. So like, I don't have to, I get to do whatever I want, right? Like I don't have to go through stuff. But when I think about the Canadian analytics community, some of the most visible members of the community are women. We've got June Lee in Toronto. We've got Kelly Kubrick here in Ottawa. Most of the organizers of eMetrics in Canada are female analysts. So the thing I thought was the most interesting about today is that regardless of how not tolerant, just kind of accepting our industry is, businesses in general are still a little bit Don Draper, Mm-hmm. And no matter how progressive I personally think our industry is, people need to wrap their heads a little bit around the fact that it is a gender agnostic business environment, not just an analytics one,
I think, for me, I think there's a couple things I learned tonight that I didn't know before. One is that I did not realize that our industry could walk up to someone after speaking at a conference and say some of the things that you've experienced, Krista, which is just appalling. And that's going on, just that troubles me. And then the other thing is like, I think to what you said, it's sometimes we're close and sometimes we're far away, but there's a lot of good things happening. And I think it's really on all of us to be aware and to drive more of that. And it's not hey, Krista, you keep working on this whole women in analytics thing. It's not your job to do. It's all of our jobs. As somebody who, leads a practice of analysts, that's something I think about all the time. How do I get the best talent? And that best talent is men and women. And how do I make an attractive place for them to work? How do I get them to really be their best professionally? And it doesn't really matter their gender. Anyway, so these are the kinds of things I'm taking away. And I think, as hard and frankly as awkward as we made the discussion tonight, Krista, thank you so much for taking the time. It's certainly not something that's like easy to talk about at all. And you yourself, being a pretty amazing analyst in your own right, thank you for shouldering that load and kind of helping us see some of that other perspective and helping us learn from it. And obviously, if you're listening today and you want to talk a little more about this, we'd really encourage you to get to us on Facebook or Twitter or in the Measure Slack. I think this is a conversation that is certainly not over because we're not done solving this problem. It's certainly not something we can do in the space of a podcast. But, our industry is a place for everyone. And the more inclusive and the more equal that we can be, I think the better outcomes we can provide for our clients and our customers and our companies. So we'd love to hear from you. Of course, as always, Krista, thank you so much for coming on the show. Next time we're at a conference together, Lagavulins on us, but only up to the 16 year because we're not. Well, maybe Tim could buy you. Do they do a 21? No. Anyways, the 16-year Lagavulin is outstanding, in my opinion. That's like a quality beverage to me. Anyways, so hopefully next time we can share a scotch. But for my co-hosts, Tim Wilson and Jim Kane, keep measuring.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter. We welcome your comments and questions. Facebook.com/Analytics Hour or at Analytics Hour on Twitter.
So smart guys wanted to fit in, so they made up a term called analytics. Analytics don't work.
Give me a chance, Tim.
Okay.
Let me wind it all up.
I love that one. But you're sipping it with ice. I would take it neat.
Oh,
yeah.
High five. Yeah.
You are more of a man than I am. Oh, my God. Okay, are we going to start this thing?
I didn't spend 9 months growing a grade 8 mustache, so I could have to do stuff like that. So. That's the sexiest thing I've ever said on the show, by the way.
That is unprecedented. I've never gotten a gift for appearing on this podcast. See, Tim has his podcasts. I have my Netflix documentaries. That is how we maintain equilibrium.
for
You know, when I get Windows 10 installed, you're all going to be sorry. Because I bet my
Said
camera
no one
will-
ever.
Said no one ever. Exactly. Quick, Jim. Say something.
So you want me to just say half a word so Tim can just pick the ball and run with it? And again,
I know I talk a ton, and I feel like I've mounted like 7 soapboxes more than even normal.
No, you're just carrying that white liberal guilt, so...
It's definitely...
I wasn't I need a woman's opinion, Tiff. I'm just kidding.
yeah,
It is.
30 seconds with him is like a day spa.
And you just caught how much Jim has held it in check for the last
good time.
hour and 20 minutes.
I'm gonna guess it rhymes with never fucking sold anything.
Rock, flag, and women.